should start there. So this may or may not be a term that you're familiar with, toxic masculinity, but I'm going to take a little bit of time and explain what it is. And I want to start by telling you guys a little story. So imagine this. This is a true story. 10-year-old boy, nice, sweet as he can be, walking to school one day with his mother. They're crossing a busy intersection, so the mother instinctively grabs his hand and they cross the street. And once they finish crossing the street, she stays holding his hand and he lets her, and they walk into the school. And once they get into the school, a male teacher notices that this 10-year-old boy is still holding his mother's hand and proceeds to make fun of him. Hey, little boy, little sissy, why are you still holding your mommy's hand? Are you a baby? Saying things like that. Now imagine that. Now imagine that this is not just a story that I made up, but it in fact happened to this boy right here, my son. 10-year-old Benjamin. Happened at his school just about 2 weeks ago. Walking in with his mom, and the PE coach there decided to make fun of him about that. And as you can imagine, this 10-year-old boy, who is still kind of trying to figure out who he is, was a little upset about it and has refused to hold her hand ever since. And while that might not seem like the biggest deal in the long run, it really upset us. And it was interesting to me because this is actually one of the things that I've been talking about and studying in this class, is this idea of real boys and being real men. So with that in mind, I want to talk about the term toxic masculinity. I don't know if you guys have heard of this term or not, but it's a term now given to this sort of commonly held notion that being a real man comes through this display of what Douglas quotes as stoicism, domination of others, sexual aggressiveness, violence, and misogyny. The idea that if you're going to be a real man, you have to be this sort of, straight, no emotion, tough person. This term is it's not a new idea. I mean, the idea that this is what a real man has been held in our society and even longer. But the term itself is relatively new. It was coined in the 1980s and the 1990s. It was actually coined, most people, when you say the term toxic masculinity, they automatically think you're talking about feminism. This was not a term coined by a feminist movement. This was a term coined by a man's movement who was trying to sort of bring some sense into what is and what isn't, healthy ideas of masculinity. The idea gained traction in the late 90s. William Pollock was a sociologist who wrote this book called Real Boys, Rescuing Our Sons from the Myths of Boyhood, and he did some extensive research watching boys as they grow up and how they interact with each other, how they interact with their teachers, how they interact with parents. And he realized that to an extent there's this unwritten, what he calls a boy code, that a lot of boys are sort of pressured into following. And as I was reading through this and talking about it and remembering my own childhood, I came to realize that, yeah, he's kind of right about this. As a boy, you're kind of expected to do a certain thing and behave a certain way. And it's seen as a necessary set of actions that these boys need to follow in order to prove that they are tough, that they're masculine, and in order to be accepted by their peers. The problem is that this code actually, rather than making these boys tough and unstoppable, puts them at risk in the future and can cause some serious problems down the road. So with that in mind, the purpose of this talk today is to examine this idea of toxic masculinity, what it is, why it's so toxic, and what we can do about it in our schools. And to do this, I wanted to talk to you guys about three basic things. The first one being that this is something that happens in school. Our schools and our classrooms are breeding grounds for this idea of toxic masculinity, of teaching and reinforcing gender stereotypes, which can lead to these strict, rigid views. In addition, toxic masculinity is a real problem. Some people, you say the term and they scoff and they laugh and say, this is stupid. It is a real problem. It has been shown to have real, serious side effects for both boys and girls, and then men and women as they grow into adults. And as educators, we can do something about this problem. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is how toxic masculinity and other things like it create and reinforce gender issues in the classroom. As I said already, schools help to sort of create and reinforce these gender stereotypes. Sometimes it's overt, but a lot of times it's secret. It's in what is called the hidden curriculum. And the hidden curriculum is a term that refers to what is taught in a school even though it doesn't show up in any textbook. It's just kind of the different things that are just kind of tend to be understood and are taught. In many cases, this idea of gender and stereotype begins pretty much on the very first day of preschool. And a lot of people have done studies about how preschools are laid out. And this was a study conducted by Bigler, Hayes, and Hamilton. I should point out, not me. Different Hamilton. But many classrooms, even beginning in pre-K, have these play areas set up with girls and boy toys. And the girls and boys are very much encouraged to play with certain toys and discouraged to play with other toys. And in some cases ridiculed and made to feel like they're doing something wrong if they play with toys that the teacher seems are not acceptable for their gender or who they are. As they grow up, teachers frequently treat their students differently based on gender. There have been numerous studies about this that show that teachers will treat boy students differently when they answer questions versus girl students differently when they answer questions. A lot of times they don't even know this. A couple years ago, this was one of the big reasons behind the influx of single-gender classrooms, because they felt like this was a problem. And in some cases, the single-gender classrooms tended to help this issue. In some cases, studies went a different way. But teachers treat their students differently based on their genders. Boys are typically given more opportunities to succeed, given more opportunities when they give the answer wrong to redo it and get it right, whereas a lot of times teachers tend to just kind of dismiss the girl answer and move on to somebody else. Boys are steered towards certain subjects and given more free rein to act up because of the expression we're all familiar with, boys will be boys. It's kind of understood, well, they're boys, so what are you going to do about it? Well, there's a lot we can do about it. At the same time, girls are steered toward other subjects, told they can't succeed in certain things. I know we've heard about the STEM gap and the gender gap when it comes to certain things like science and technology. That's a big issue that's going on right now. Told that they have to behave a certain way like little princesses, in that they have to worry about boys and how boys see them, because up here boys will be boys, so boys can't be expected to, patrol themselves and to act accordingly. We have to let the girls, or we have to protect the girls because the boys are just out of control, and what are we going to do about it? In middle school, where we are now, these stereotypes become much more entrenched. And it's considered especially important because really in middle school is where boys and girls, and we know this, we've seen this in our classes, this is where they're kind of figuring out who they are. This is where they're really starting to establish their own identities. And these stereotypes and the gender roles that they've been taught up until this point really become sort of hardened. And it's thought that once you get past middle school, it's really hard to change their ideas about this. Peer pressure also becomes a much bigger problem in middle school. And it's during this time that many students start to conform to some of the more extreme ideas about gender. At the same time in middle school, bullying really ramps up a notch and becomes much more commonplace. I know it's an issue we have here at Greg. All of us have seen instances of it in our class, at Courtyard, in the hallways. We try to stop it from time to time. We try to stop it every time we see it, but we can't get it. But targets frequently become more along the lines of boys and girls, especially boys, who don't exhibit what other students think of as manly behavior or as traditional male behavior. So with all that being said, I want to stress that I'm not talking about it being wrong to talk about being a boy or being a girl. That's not what this is about. It's not saying it's bad to be a typical boy or it's bad to be a typical girl. There's a difference between that and what is called toxic masculinity. And toxic masculinity is really the focus here. And the term toxic becomes the term when the notion of manhood damages the people who conform to it, because there are people who believe that in order to be a man, you have to buy into certain things. You have to be strong. If you're not a man, you don't have muscles. Or if you want to take it to the extreme, there's this guy. I think there's a little bit of Photoshop happening there. But still, or you have to be tough. You have to be surrounded with women who are in subservient roles to you. And you have to be fighting and winning all the time, good at sports, things like that. This is when the idea of toxic masculinity becomes poisonous. And that's the problem that we are seeing in our schools. And there's plenty of evidence that shows that this strict narrow view of masculinity actually acts like a poison, damaging everyone that comes into contact with it. In adults, men who cling to this view of being a man are more likely to suffer from depression, alcoholism, rage disorders. They're more likely to have problems and not seek help for the problems, because if there's one thing a tough man doesn't want to do, it's ask for help. at any point. So these issues become real issues, and asking for help is the last thing that they're going to do. It makes them difficult for them to enter into these healthy relationships. They're taught very early on that a relationship is about power, is about aggression, is about winning. And you can't have a healthy emotional relationship with somebody when you treat them as a competition that you have to try to win. And so because of that, they are much more likely to be abusive, hostile towards partners, and they're a much greater risk for committing physical and sexual assault later on. They're also, this is something I found out that really surprised me, much more at risk for early death due to what are called despair deaths. So these are deaths that you get from an unhealthy life that comes with trying to cope with your issues. Smoking, drinking, things like that. Much more at risk for that because you're trying to cope. If you're not going to get help from the psychologist, you're going to get help from somewhere, and it's going to come from a bottle or a cigarette or something like that. Now for students, these stereotypes also have negative consequences. Boys report intense pressure to conform when they're in middle school, and those who don't are at risk of suffering from depression, which is something I mentioned before. They're also at a much higher risk of social and academic disengagement. In other words, they really start to disattach themselves from school and from their peers. They don't try to succeed, they don't try to fit in, because they feel like anything they do, they can't win. They are also the subject of bullying, which leads to a lot of problems in its own right, and that's a subject for a different talk. Students who have felt this pressure and been bullied have been documented as going to extreme lengths to prove to their peers that they are real men. I found several studies that documented students who literally committed sexual assault, not because they were interested in the girls or anything like that, but because they wanted to feel like they were a real man. They wanted to fit in, and so that was the easiest way that they knew to prove it, was to dominate other people. So what can we do about this? Well, this is a hard question to answer. There are no real steps, do this, or this, and the problem is solved. So really, it all boils down to education and awareness and intervention. So educators, myself included, need to work towards changing the culture of schools and the classrooms. It has to happen first by realizing that talking is not a problem. Sometimes people don't want to even talk about this because they view it as emasculating. Well, we can't talk about this problem because we're just attacking men, we're attacking masculinity, and we have to get over that mindset. This is something that needs to be talked about. Otherwise, it's never going to get improved. Students also need to learn that it's okay to share. It's okay to care about grades. Caring about grades, for some people, is even seen as a girly problem. And so because of that, they don't even want to try. And it's okay to not fit into what are considered the rigid gender roles. More importantly, educators need to be aware of what they model in the classrooms, the hallways, the cafeterias, and the gym. They learn a lot about this by watching us. And this is something we need to work on, myself included, definitely. This study here, Chin and Kurtner-Smith, is an example of how teachers can actually do something right. This is a study by some PE teachers who tried a couple of different tactics in their PE class and created an environment where all of the students, not just the boys, but the girls and the boys who were not good at sports at all, felt like they were really a part of something and could succeed in what they were being asked to do. And so this is just one example of many studies I found that show that educators can change the culture of their classroom and how they approach things and how they approach students. So what I want you guys to do, and I'm including myself again, think about your own classroom. How do you approach subjects like this in your classroom? Be aware of how this rigid stereotype shows up everywhere, and think about how it could impact your male and female students. Notice how students react towards each other and to those students who don't fit in. This is a big one. You have to be vigilant. You have to be watching as you go around. And probably most importantly when it comes to all of it is be ready to step in when needed.